Do you find it difficult getting across the Gold Star Bridge? What if you had to take a ferry? Stay tuned as we talk with Jim Streeter, our town historian, on this week's edition of Welcome to Groton. Welcome to Groton. I'm your host, Carol Pratt, and with me today is Jim Streeter, our town historian. Jim, thanks for coming on. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program. I think you know more about Groton than anyone in the town.
No, I'll disagree with that. My mentor, Carol Kimball, had more information in her little finger than I have in my entire body.
She passed it all on to you, I think.
Well, a considerable amount of it, yes.
How did you become interested in local history? Was it through talking with Carol Kimball?
No, I think it was years ago when I was on the police department. I used to, kind of communicate with all the citizens, and when you started talking to the older folks, they started relaying information about what was here and what was there, and it just intrigued me. So I developed a keen interest in it and been going ever since.
Oh wow! Now, how did people get across the Thames River?
Well, that's a very lengthy story, and actually I started doing a presentation for documenting the bridges.
Yes.
That go across the Thames. And when I started that, I learned you can't talk about those bridges before you start talking about ferry boats and canoes and things like that. So that's how it started. If you go way back, well, John Winthrop came from England and actually founded our plantation. They call it the Pequot plantation, and it went from Niantic to Pawcatuck.
Oh, wow.
And you notice I said Pequot Plantation.
Yeah.
We didn't hear of New London. Actually, it was called Namiog.
Oh, okay.
That was the name of New London. And the river was not called Thames River. It was called the Great River.
The Great?
The Great River.
I've never heard that.
Yep. And the inhabitants, they petitioned the Common Court from England to call New London London. The court said, no, we don't care for that name. We'd like to have it called Fair Harbor. Fair Harbor. So,
okay. Which accounts for a lot of the names you hear
in
right. London, Fair Harbor Place and things like that, yeah.
The inhabitants didn't like that. So about 5 years later, they did a compromise, and they called it New London. At the same time, when the inhabitants were here, they also crossed borders from New London to Groton. Okay? Now, Groton was called East London.
Oh.
All right? Or the Common Court wanted to call it East London.
Yeah.
And we rejected that, and ultimately it was called Groton, thank goodness, which was the home of John Winthrop.
Wow.
Over in England. Yeah. So we started, the settlers started raising crops and having their cows and pigs on the Groton side. So they needed transportation back and forth. And at first they would start with canoes.
Oh, wow.
Remember, we're talking 1650s.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
We're talking very primitive canoes. They're called dugout canoes.
Okay. And they would put a cow in a dugout?
They had some large dugout.
Wow.
Yeah. And these dugout canoes were actually large logs that they would hollow out and burn out and use that. So ultimately, the traffic became so intense that people wanted to go back and forth to their properties that they petitioned John Winthrop and the I guess you call the court of John Winthrop,
right.
Like our town council,
right.
and said we need to have transportation. We need somebody to do this full time. So one of the second groups of settlers that came in, say around 1655, Edward Messenger, was appointed to be the ferryman. Oh. And he received actually a 20-year lease. And he could charge for it. And then he also was granted permission to take his cows over to Groton to keep his calves over there.
But the ferry service at that point was just canoes and
Just
dugouts
canoes.
or scows or whatever they
Nope.
called them?
So the canoes, and Messenger had made a promise that he would put on a scow, a flat bottom wide boat, within a year or so. Well, unfortunately, Mr. Messenger only kept it for 2 years, and then he moved to Windsor.
Maybe that's why we don't see anything named Messenger in the
Yeah, probably.
You know how everybody has there's a reason for the street names and stuff, but I don't think we have anything named Messenger.
No, we don't. Not that I'm aware of.
So they must have been angry about that.
Well, Mr. Winthrop was, because it fell back into his hands because
Sure.
he was the leader of the settlement. So within a few years, I would say a year later after Messenger left, he gave a 50-year lease to Carrie Latham. Now that's a familiar name for everybody.
The same Latham as the Latham House?
They're all related
Yeah.
in some ways.
Yeah.
The 50-year lease was interesting because they actually, he actually indicated that he would put on, not only, he would start with a canoe, but then he also would put on a flat bottom boat.
Now, there were existing boats that he was using then, so he didn't, or did he? He probably
I
had
think
to build more.
you know, and it's all conjecture because
Yeah.
the information relating to the ferries back in 1650s
is sketchy at
scarce,
best.
very
Yeah,
scarce. Part of the lease required that he would move to the east side, which is Groton side.
Right.
New London provided property, and that he would have to build a house so he could keep the ferry there and keep the ferry upkept. He did this. Part of the lease also said that for the passengers of his ferry, he was permitted to provide them with liquor and wine as refreshments.
To get more passengers.
Well, I think probably for purposes, because the passenger probably scared heck.
Oh, that's true.
They needed a
Calm
reason
down.
to calm down. He did start with a good canoe and a dugout type. And
And do we know where that landing was located?
yes, it's right across the street from the Avery Cop House.
Okay.
And we have some photographs of the Latham House, which ultimately became the tavern.
Oh.
Okay, the Ferry Tavern.
Oh, there was a ferry tavern in the other side.
Yeah,
of
there was
the,
way out East Line,
way
I think
out,
it was.
yeah. Oh, I'll be darned.
And that stayed for years. I remember that growing up. And I'm a little older, but I think it was torn down probably in the 60s or 70s.
Really?
So that house was one of the older houses we had. And because of his moving there, he's almost considered one of the first settlers for Groton Bank in Groton. Now, an interesting part, because of the lease, he wanted some money.
Yeah.
So he was permitted to charge 3 pence for a passenger,
3 pence for a person.
6
Okay.
pence for a horse, and 3 pence for every calf or swine or pig.
Now, did that include your booze on the way?
I don't know.
Oh, they probably got the tavern business that way.
But
yeah.
what was interesting,
Isn't that funny?
and I try to relate, you and I did a presentation on Morton Plant once, and we wanted to know what was the relative cost factor in today's money.
Yeah.
My wife and I searched for 2 days. We can't figure out what a pence was worth.
Oh, wow.
So in 1651. So if anybody in the audience knows, please let us know so we'll know what that
I'll be
was.
darned. I assumed it was 3 cents, but see. Yeah.
Now, the other provision that was in his lease required that no English or Indians were permitted to operate / charge, operate and charge another ferry in the area.
Oh.
If they did, Mr. Latham could turn around and charge those people the
So
fee.
he had a monopoly.
Oh, absolutely, and it is written in the grant or in the lease that he would have a monopoly.
Wow.
So that's where we started with that, and
So that was the beginning ferries. Now, when did the steamboat, what you're used to seeing or reading about steamboat ferries, when did those start up?
those came much later.
Okay.
Again, we had various scows, and the scows are a flat bottom wooden boat, and you could row them or scull them.
Wow.
Right? And then between the scows and the steamboats. We had horse ferries.
Horse ferries.
Horse ferries. The horse ferries, what they did, they placed them on either side of the boat, and there was usually teams of 2 on each side or teams of 3 on each side. And below them,
On a platform on either side of
platform, and below them, and their knees would be about level with the top deck, but below that was a treadmill. And the treadmill, they would move the treadmill, and the treadmill had a reduction gear on it or a gear on it that would turn a paddle underneath the thing. While doing this research, it seems cruel and sounds cruel, but the information is that most of the horses were blind. And they did that on purpose because they did, you know, the water's rocking and noise on the boats, and if they became upset, then they would rear up and they'd have a lot of problems.
Now, you're saying they're blind. Did they put blinders on them, or?
No, they were blind.
Oh, dear.
Okay?
Oh, dear.
So the ASPA would certainly be upset with that. And I think I would too, and I think your idea of putting blinders on them would have been better.
Yeah, would have been better, Yep. But they didn't want them to,
And that operated for quite a while. I believe it operated like that until 1729.
Now, did they
Actually,
charge?
the horse boat took over in 1721, I'm sorry. It took over in
And they charged for that, probably more now, because they've got horses.
You know, there was nothing in
that.
the information that I could find where they charged for it, but I'm sure they did.
Now, where did they, the horses, where did they keep them in between running the ferries, you know? Did they have like stalls?
My understanding that, and in the writings, they say across the way from the tavern, there was a horse shed. And I'm thinking of the Avery Cop House has their carriage shed. I'm thinking about in that area on the Groton side, and then in the London side, the ferry slip on the London side started out toward where the railroad bridge is now, on that side, Winthrop's Neck, I think they called it.
Wow.
And there was a facility over there for storing horses.
This is fascinating, but we got to take a break. Please stay tuned, because we've got a lot of more information on the ferries.
So this is my computer.
This is your computer. Let's go on the internet.
Let's go. Click it.
Yes.
Okay.
I cursor in between the R and the E. Pressing dot, I want you to just push the period.
She's gonna love me all over again now.
That's it. Jamaica, here you come.
Here we go.
Good job.
Thank you. Thank you. And I did it by myself. Feel smarter.
We have a job to do out here today.
To be a winning team, you have to work like a winning team.
My team depends on me.
And my team is 50,000 strong. Looks like a lot of work's going into this.
This is what it feels like to be part of a team.
A winning team.
The action team.
Action team! Get in on the action at actionteam.org. Are you in?
Welcome back. We're talking with our town historian, Jim Streeter. So, Jim, these horse ferries, as you call them, how big were they? I mean, could they take a lot of people or a lot of equipment? Or?
Well, I did read one article that indicated that they were large enough where they could fit 4 stagecoaches, and each stagecoach would have 4 horses. So that's pretty large. That's a pretty large facility.
Holy cow. And you said in your notes you found how much they charged.
Interestingly, and I did, it was 4 cents for each person. It was, for a horse and wagon, 20 cents. And if you were to bring a cord of wood, which you would have to have a wagon for that, it was 50 cents. But it didn't make a difference if you had 1 or 2 or 3 what they call yokes, and yokes being oxen, which would be pulling the wagon.
Unbelievable.
So they made a few dollars.
Now, I'm picturing these people on this ferry with the horses and the oxen and all that, and I'm thinking, what if all of a sudden, like, this thunderstorm came or whatever? Did they have any protection from the elements?
Yes, some of the ferries, most of the ferries, had a small enclosure for women.
Only for women?
For women passengers. Other than that, you weathered the storm.
And no one worried about handicapped access back then or anything like that?
No, and there are some stories where the roads leading to them were rickety, and oftentimes horses would trip and fall over, and the wagon would be up, and it would cause all sorts of heck, and they'd have to bring the horse up, and so it wasn't the greatest situation.
Oh, I can't imagine. So we had these horse ferries, and then what started the steam ferries? Did they hear about them from down south?
The horse ferries, again, they weren't reliable, and they were kind of cruel. So in 1835, another person had been granted the lease, and he said he would bring in a ferry boat. So he did. I don't know the name of it, but they tried it for a while, and it was too big.
Too big?
And too expensive. Too big for the landings. And he had to charge a considerable fee because of the coal and things that they needed, the coal and wood that they needed to keep the steam engines going. So they discontinued it within a year. And you would have thought that, well, let's keep going and bring in another ferry boat. But they waited another 10 years and went back to the horse boat.
They just didn't get a smaller one, they went back to the horses.
They went back to the other one. So it was about 10 years later that they did start with the actual steam ferries that were capable of landing and bringing back and forth. Go ahead.
Did they use the same landings, once they went to steam, did they use the same landing areas that they did for the horses, or did they build new ones?
Yes, well, they upgraded them. You'll find where they made improvements to their things. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, at that point, the New London ferry had moved to where the parade is, where the train station is. That's what they call the parade in New London. That their ferry boat landing moved to that area.
And the Groton one was still by the Avery Cop?
By Avery Cop. In fact, interesting, if you ride down Thames Street where Avery Cop is, you will see on the sidewalk, Ferry Spring, there's a water fountain there.
Oh, wow.
And that's where the horses, with the stagecoaches, they would stop there to have water, refresh themselves. And that spring is still there. It's cemented now. It's a more formal fountain, but it's still there. So,
wow. Now, there's a mention in my notes about School Street. Was there a landing at School Street?
Yeah. And this is what really impacted me. All my life, I thought the ferry slip was at School Street. But then, of course, in doing the research, we find it was up the road across the street from A.V. Cop. I have some tentative dates when they moved. It started at that ferry landing.
Oh, okay.
All right. The Carrie Latham landing, we'll call it for lack of a, from 1655 to 1794.
Okay.
Then from 1794 to 1886, and this shocked me, right, they were at the end of Pleasant Street.
Oh, wow.
Right, which interests me because I live on Pleasant Street. And they were behind, there was a series of buildings. There was the Groton Grange. My father ran a store in their fish and tackle store. And there was Morgan and White's, that we know of Morgan and White's. It was called Coe and Bailey. It was in the back of there.
Wow.
Until 1886.
Holy cow.
And then it moved to School Street.
Wow.
So in 1886 is when it moved to School Street, and it remained there until they closed.
Oh, wow.
So
you said the steamboats came, then the horses came back because they didn't like them. So then they, at some point, they went back to steam?
They went back to the steamboats.
They got a smaller boat?
There was a smaller boat in I think it was like January of 1852. They brought in the Mohegan, and it was only 55 feet long. I think it was 30 feet wide.
So nowhere near the sizes of our Block Island ferries and things like that.
But because of the increase in traffic, by traffic, passengers and stagecoaches and wagons with cords of wood and hay, in 1872 they went to a larger boat called the Uncas, and that was a 76-foot boat.
Wow.
And by the way, that was built in Mystic.
Oh,
And then in 1891, they went to the Colonel Ledyard, was the name of the ferry boat, rightfully so.
yes, yes.
And that was a 110-footer.
Wow.
And that was built at the Robert Palmer boatyard in Noank.
In Noank.
In Noank.
All local.
And the last one that I can see that was made was in 1905, and it was the Governor Winthrop. And that was 134 feet long. Wow. And that was also built by Robert Palmer's boatyard in Noank. Wow. I have some other photos that are in there where some other ferry boats would get, it's like Essex had ferry boats, and so they would exchange. If one was broken down, they would explain, you know, and because I was trying to figure, I've got all these boats listed, but I see some names of some other boats.
And there must have been, because that Ferry Tavern restaurant that we spoke of that's over by Old Saybrook, Essex, there must have been ferries there, too.
I'm sure they stopped in for some good spirits. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that's something, oh, wow.
So those ferries actually operated until the ferry system closed down. And
Now, people have to understand, there was no bridge
There
during
was-
all this time between New London and Groton.
There was not.
no bridge.
There was not. And an interesting thing is, and I think you asked me before the show, well, how did the ferries or the railroads get back
Yeah,
and forth? And that was that was a very, very important thing for our commerce, were the railroad ferries. We had to get the ferries from New London to Groton and Groton to New London.
So the railroad cars went on a ferry?
The
or-
railroad cars went on a ferry. They would have the engines on either side to pull them off the ferries. And that started in 1858. And the New London Railroad Ferry was at the parade at the, where the train station is now.
Right.
And Groton's was down toward EB, at Electric Boat. It wasn't Electric Boat then.
Right.
Where the road splits. And at first, there was a small ferry, and it could hold probably 3 cars, with passengers also.
Wow.
Okay, and then ultimately, I think that boat was called the Shoreline. They just got the name Shoreline.
Yeah.
And then ultimately they built some larger ones, and one was called the Groton, and that could hold 8 cars, 8 railroad cars. So it was quite a system. And now we'll go right back to what you started. We didn't have a bridge.
Right.
We built our first bridge across the river, railroad bridge, because of the amount of train traffic we had in 1889.
So first there was a railroad bridge, not a traffic.
That's
There were
correct.
no cars. So.
But in 1889, when they built the first bridge, which was a railroad bridge, the railroad ferries discontinued.
This might be a dumb question, but because that was the only bridge, could farmers or anyone take their horses and use that bridge, you know, if a train wasn't coming or something?
No, because of the construction, because of the width of the rails and things like that,
okay.
and the wagon wheels and things
Yeah,
like this.
yeah.
Ultimately, in I think it was 1919, we built a second bridge. Because the first railroad bridge, and we'll talk about that when I do that presentation on the bridges.
Right.
The train locomotives became so heavy that the bridge started to sink.
Oh dear.
So they built a new railroad bridge. And when they did that, the railroad turned the first railroad bridge over to the state of Connecticut, who converted it into a vehicle bridge.
So that's when ultimately the ferries pretty much stopped?
Pretty much, because they ultimately, with that vehicle bridge, they also put trolley tracks on it, and they had a walkway on it. So most of the people would utilize that.
Yeah, because I'm sure prices were going up too. So
Yes, they were.
said, we'll just walk. How far is it, do you know, from the shore to,
Yeah,
from the bank to New London?
That's why when they first opened up the ferry, they had, remember I said near, the New London side was near where the railroad bridge is, and of course the Ferry Tavern is near where the thing. It was a little over a half of a mile across the river.
So easily traversed on foot on one of those little pathways.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I bet you a lot of people did do that to save money, yeah. Now, you said you're going to do a presentation on just bridges. Is that, I don't know where you find the time to do this, but that's terrific for us.
That's the fun of history.
And that's going to be the bridges all throughout Groton?
All throughout, because, well, the Thames River bridges, quite a history there. and when you go into the construction of them. And
Is that the only bridge that was there? Was there ever one down by the sub base or any of those?
there was one up in Norwich.
Oh, see
Yeah,
that?
There was
Yeah.
one up in Norwich. Still
Yeah.
is one up there. That
Wow.
crosses at a narrow part.
Wow. How often, I didn't ask you this, how often did these ferries run? Was it like constant service?
Well, at first it was more of a convenience. If you needed one, you would make arrangements and you would go over. We're talking like in the 1650s and
Oh, yeah,
1670s.
yeah.
All right. But when the steamboat ferries were running, they would run 2 or 3 trips an hour.
Oh, wow.
Well, depending. I mean, those horses were unreliable.
Right.
Things like this. And the hours were quite interesting because on weekdays they ran from 7:30 in the morning to 11:30 at night.
Wow.
On Sundays they had a reprieve. They ran from I think it was 9:30 to 10:30 at
Wow.
night.
Jim, this has been fascinating. I want to thank you so much for coming on the program. I've learned a lot, and I hope everybody
Good.
else did too.
glad.
Before we wrap up our program, let's look at the upcoming town meetings for the next 2 weeks. If you'd like more information about Groton's local history, come to the Groton Public Library. Jim Streeter has published 4 books on our local history. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join us for the next edition of Welcome to Groton.
For questions and comments concerning Welcome to Groton, you can write to the Town of Groton, Connecticut, Town Manager's Office, 45 Fort Hill Road, Groton, Connecticut 06340. Or you can call 441-6630